Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What are Electricity Markets and Why Do They Matter? My name is Marion Gold, and I'm a senior advisor with the National Association of State Energy Officials, aka NASEO. I have both a regulatory and a policy background, and my experience has really heightened my appreciation for the impact that electricity markets have on energy policy and also for the complexity of market issues. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. For those who are not familiar with NASEO, next slide, please, Camille. We're a national nonprofit that supports all 56 state and territory energy offices throughout the United States. We serve as a resource for and about state energy offices. We work on a wide spectrum of issues, including hosting national dialogues on critical issues, including the electricity market structure, which is the topic of our webinar today. Today's webinar is in support of NASEO's Electricity Markets Education Initiative, which is funded through the DOE Grid Deployment Office, or GDO. The objective of this initiative is to educate key decision makers on the spectrum of electricity markets and programs and products. No matter whether your state is in an area with an organized market, an RTO or an ISO, or in a region with a more traditional market structure, how these systems operate has a really big impact on state goals ranging from affordability and reliability to economic development. And I should add that the impetus for this project included listening sessions with state energy officials. And we heard at that time that providing neutral and accessible information and technical assistance on electricity markets would be valuable to our colleagues across the country. Through the work of this project, we hope to provide that kind of assistance and ultimately strengthen your ability to effectively engage on these issues. And of course, we're really excited and pleased to have the support from DOE's GDO. Okay, before we start, a few housekeeping reminders. This is a Zoom webinar format, so only the speakers and the panelists will have camera and mic access. But we do welcome questions, so please use the Q&A function if you have clarifying questions as we go along, and we'll leave time for more Q&A at the end. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the NASEO website. Okay, now to our webinar content. With that, we're fortunate to have two outstanding technical advisors who will be joining us today for a conversation about electricity markets, and we'll try to keep it fun and light if you can do that on this subject, which I think we can. Amanda Ormond is a principal at the Ormond Group. She brings decades of experience working with Western states and stakeholders on electricity market design, governance, and the clean energy transition. Dr. Frank Felder is an internationally recognized expert on electricity markets and planning. Frank has deep academic and applied expertise, and he's advised states, RTOs, and federal agencies on market structure and regulation. Together, Frank and Amanda will walk us through the fundamentals of the U.S. wholesale electricity markets, different market structures, and some of the key issues that are facing states today. It's a complicated subject. We've done our best to break it into bite-sized chunks, but again, please use the Q&A function if you have any questions as we go along. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to kick it off.
Thanks, Marion. Welcome, everybody. So the topic of understanding wholesale electricity markets is important to state energy office and to policymakers for a number of reasons. One is having a market or not is going to affect reliability of the electricity system. It's going to help determine what types of generation sources are put on the grid. It's going to help determine how the transmission system is planned, how it's going to be built, and how it's operating. It's going to have an effect on electricity prices that customers are going to see, and it'll affect economic development in our different states. I wanted to give you an example of reliability, the difference when you have a market and when you don't. We have in the Western United States, the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which is a small market product where it's an electronic trading platform between buyers and sellers. And this market has helped to bring different utilities together and interconnect them a little more closely. Before we had this market in 2011, there was a blackout in Arizona, and the blackout spread to California. But because there was no sophisticated market product that could show what was happening in these different utility areas, literally the Arizona utility had to call the California utility and say, do you have power? Do you not have power? So the visibility between these utility systems was not there where it is now because we've got this Western energy imbalance market. So it's an example of how reliability can be supported by having different market products. When I think about wholesale electricity markets, at their core, what we're doing is we're taking individual utilities, or more appropriately, it's individual balancing authority is the term, but taking these individual utilities and getting them to cooperate and coordinate more closely and share energy resources. And so the way that they plan and build and manage the electricity system is more closely coordinated. That's essentially what we want to do with markets. There are a variety of different market products and services that are deployed all throughout the nation, and we're going to talk about some of those today. Some of those are probably already in your states. So before we get a little deeper, I want to step back for a second and talk about the power sector generally and some of the challenges and opportunities that we're seeing. And I think a lot of these are going to be very familiar to you. One of the big challenges now is load growth. We have data centers, AI, manufacturing facilities that need lots of new power, and they need it rather quickly. We also have electrification of the transportation sector and the building sector. So all of this is putting pressure on building new generation sources and doing it as quickly as we can while still being reliable and still being cost competitive for customers. Another challenge that we're seeing is needing to expand the transmission system. That's obviously the highway that gets the generation where it's generated to the people who need it. We are seeing this needed transmission expansion because of demand increases, but also to improve reliability. Coupled with expanding the transmission system is trying to make the interconnection queue, which is the line that all the generators stand in to try to connect to the high voltage transmission system. We need to make that more efficient and less cumbersome. There are literally gigawatts worth of generation around the country waiting to get on the transmission system, waiting to build their projects to be able to get electricity on the grid. So we need to be working on that interconnection queue, which is happening in many places in the country. And then finally, a lot of states have developed policies. They might be clean energy policies, they might be carbon goals, they might be policies to get coal off the system, or maybe a state is interested in developing its nuclear capabilities. All of these policies have an effect on how the transmission system, how the generation system, and ultimately the entire electricity system will be planned and built and managed. So as states that have skin in the game on this issue, we wanted to posit some questions for you to be thinking about as we go through this webinar. You're going to be in the position either as energy office or public utility commissioners or as utilities to compare and contrast different market options. So thinking about how are you going to do that as a state official? Another question relates to how do you quantify what are the benefits of these different regional markets? You know, how is it going to benefit your state? Is it going to benefit your utility? And ultimately, is it going to benefit the customers of the states? Another thing to think about is if your state does one thing, how does that affect the states around you? How is that impactful to the region? So thinking about your positions related to those neighbors. So we're hoping to provide you some background information that can help you think about those questions as we move forward. So let's get into the topic of our webinar. We have an hour. We're going to stop at about 10 till to answer questions that we've gotten in the chat. So please do ask clarifying and other questions. So Frank, about 30 years ago, the US started embarking on the development of electricity markets. Electric utilities had different roles back then than they do now. Can you tell us about how utilities operated before we had markets and how they're operating now within markets?
Yeah, no, thank you, Amanda. So 30 years ago and before then, typically you and I would have gotten our power from a utility. It was integrated, meaning it owned generation, transmission, and distribution. It had a well-defined service territory, and that utility was required by public policy to serve all electrical customers in that service territory, and no other utility could serve those customers. So we established a monopoly, a single provider of electricity for a particular part of a state or region. As a result, you had to regulate the price that the utility would charge because you don't want the utility to charge, act as an unregulated monopoly. And the thought behind this, the premise, which was true at the time, is that by having a large utility that's integrated across the entire production or supply chain, it would be more efficient. It would be less costly than having multiple utilities competing for multiple customers. Imagine your house if it had 2 or 3 or 4 different distribution lines going to it from 3 or 4 different utilities. So that was the premise of the structure up till about 30 years ago.
And then tell me how it changed. How are utilities then operating in markets?
So over time, people then revisited that premise, and due to a variety of technological changes and regulatory changes, the premise changed by having competitive generation, that's the production of electricity, was able to be done. In other words, we could still have a utility, a single regulated monopoly, a single utility that transmitted and delivered the power, but we would have multiple competitors to produce electricity. And the premise, the presupposition was that electricity markets would be a better means of achieving the efficiencies in terms of lowering costs and improving reliability for the sector.
And part of that is because you've got multiple entities competing to provide power. And so competition drives down prices.
That's right. So you need sufficient amount of competition in order to achieve that result. That's right.
Okay, great. So what is motivating the development of electricity markets now?
Yeah, you hit on them in the introduction. So one is transparency. So one effect of markets, if they're well functioning, competitive, is prices provide signals to buyers and sellers to produce more, to consume less, to develop or retire power plants, to build out new factories. You mentioned data centers and electrification. So the notion of prices as a signal to increase the efficiency, not only of the sector, the electric power sector, but the economy overall, is one important piece. The second is just to run the system better, at least the generation part of the system, the production of electricity, better investments, increased operational efficiencies, and so forth, that competition, if functioning well, results in. And the third is a transfer of risk away from ratepayers to the developers and operators of power plants. So under the old utility model, where the utility was completely integrated, it had to look forward 5, 7 years to invest in new power plants. But if economic conditions changed, there was a recession or new technologies came to fruition, then they may have invested in generation assets, power plants that weren't economic. Under the old model, those costs, for the most part, were imposed upon you and me. After all, we asked the utility to make those investments. They may have been prudent at the time, but later on, uneconomic. Under a market model for generation, if I go off and develop a power plant and there are cost overruns, or I don't bring it to market on time, or I can't operate it efficiently, or newer technologies displace me, those risks are borne by my investors as opposed to ratepayers in general.
Great, thanks. So as markets expand, are there additional benefits that states should be aware of that markets could bring?
So one effect of markets, or an important consequence, is you want larger regional markets, one, to get more competition. So if there are more generators over a larger region competing to supply electricity, then that increases the efficiency. And as you expand out the market, then you start thinking about, as you mentioned at the start, transmission planning, right? We need to have a transmission system that accommodates that market and that larger geographical area. And once you also do that, as you have a larger resource base with more diversity, kind of like diversity in a stock portfolio or financial portfolio, then you can improve reliability at lower cost because you have more options. The grid operator, the balancing authority, has more options to respond to reliability. And you can meet the same level of reliability with less spare generation because of the diversity and the large regional footprint.
Yeah, that's a key point because the reserves, which is the excess energy that utilities have to carry to make sure that if a power plant trips off or a transmission line is not working, they carry sometimes around 15% extra reserves. Those are expensive. And what we've seen in some markets is that that percentage can go down. And so everybody saves because you're sharing. So that's
Absolutely.
So what are some of the concerns with electricity markets?
Well, with any market, but electricity in particular, electricity markets, one concern is market power. Is there sufficient competition? There's some just characteristics of electricity that make that an important concern. Another is ensuring that states, from a state perspective, have enough voice, a sufficient voice in the governance structure of these markets. And we'll talk more about that later. But as you can imagine, if you expand the market over multiple states, and if the major driver of investment, not the only, but the major driver is market conditions, individual states in a larger region would have presumably less of a voice or influence on that market. And for some of the reasons you articulated, that may be something they want to adjust or account for. The other piece is as you have these larger regional markets, not surprisingly, smart people figure out how to buy low and sell high. And as a result, the prices, the wholesale electricity prices, maybe not the retail, but the wholesale electricity prices start to converge, right? Because people will try to arbitrage those price differences. They'll build in the more expensive areas, new generation. Demand will maybe shift to the lower cost because of the price visibility. So you may have effect on wholesale prices across the region that may affect different states differently.
Great, thank you. So now I want to shift a little bit to the different types of electricity markets. So we've kind of looked at motivations and some of the pros and cons. Let's talk about what are the different types of electricity markets that we have right now in the U.S.
So it'd be good to go to the first slide now. So in the U.S., we have two major types, architects of electricity markets. One group we'll call RTOs, ISOs. So those are regional transmission organizations, RTOs, or ISOs, independent system operators. And for our purposes, those two abbreviations and terms are the same. So if you see on this map, about 60% of the country, depends if you do it by geography or load demand, are within an RTO ISO. And they have various names just due to historical reasons. For example, the Southwest Power Pool is an RTO, or ERCOT in most of Texas. In the beige part of the map is the second model of electricity markets. I'm going to call it a physical bilateral market. Another way to characterize these two markets is that these RTO, ISO markets are centralized. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Whereas the non-RTO regions, so the Southeast and much of the West, with some qualifications to come outside of California, are these more decentralized or physical bilateral markets.
Yeah, and for the West, I mentioned balancing authorities or utilities. There are 39 different entities in that tan area in the West that provide electrical service to different customers. So it's a very fragmented system in the West, and that's why coordination and cooperation is important. So tell us, what is an RTO and ISO? What does it do? Why do we want one or not?
So there are four major functions that these RTOs, ISOs do. One is it operates the generation and transmission system. So that's an integrated system. The production and transmission of electricity requires complex operations both within the footprint of the RTO and with its neighbors. The second is, in conjunction with that operation, it administers the wholesale electricity market. So wholesale means the buying and selling of power at the wholesale level that then is resold at the retail level to end-use customers, homes, businesses, industrial facilities. So it administers, it calculates the prices, it conducts the financial settlements between buyers and sellers at the wholesale level. The third function is it assesses and monitors that market for market power and market efficiency. So it figures out, it tries to prevent anti-competitive behavior, it updates the markets, it changes the rules in conjunctions with stakeholders, as we'll discuss, to improve the types of products and services at the wholesale level. And then fourth, it conducts transmission planning. Now recall that transmission is still a regulated part of the system. It's a cost of service model where the utility builds the transmission system and gets approval for the rates, the tariff, the price it can charge for those services. But as we mentioned, because of the broader market footprint, it's important to coordinate across those multiple utilities within the RTO footprint. So it also leads the effort in conjunction with utilities and stakeholders on transmission planning.
Very good. Okay. So will you compare for us ISOs and RTOs to a physical bilateral market that's used in the Southeast and the West?
Yes, so in those regions that do not have an RTO or an ISO, there are still market transactions, and we'll talk more detail about what's going on in each of those regions. But basically, if I was a power plant, an independent power producer, and Amanda, you were a municipality or utility, and you needed to buy power, maybe short-term or long-term for whatever reasons, you and I would arrange a bilateral one-to-one agreement. I'm the seller, you're the buyer. We would sit down and figure out, how much power over what time period and at what cost and other terms and conditions, and we would sign a contract. I would then coordinate with the utility where my power plant is attached, and I would buy the transmission service from me to you, and I would pay, and presumably that would be reflected in our business arrangements, the transmission service, which is at a regulated price, to ship my power from me to you. There's no centralized or single administrator of the markets. There's no central place where anyone could go to see what prices are being charged. It's just a physical bilateral market between me and you.
Sounds good. And then how does it operate in an RTO or ISO?
So in an RTO or an ISO, the ISO is among other things, is centralized administrator, and you can go on its website and you can see maps of the prices of power at different times in different locations. Individual generators offer in to the ISO, kind of like an auction. It's called an auction, complicated. And then buyers at the wholesale level offer in what they're willing to pay. The ISO runs a complicated algorithm to clear the market, subject to reliability concerns, and then it settles the market based on how much of my offer into the market as a seller was accepted and how much you bought as a buyer of electricity in the wholesale market.
Yeah. Frank's located in the East and I'm located in the West. In the West, what we've seen is that bilateral market where you buy and sell between two entities has been very effective in the past, but the challenges in the electricity sector are changing. So we've got weather variability that we didn't used to have. We've got resources that are variable-based resources. And so flexibility in the system is really important. And when you have very firm contracts, that really doesn't work so well when you need increasing amounts of flexibility. And so that's part of the reason we're seeing some of these changes in markets.
And it's probably on that point to go to the next slide, which underscores these balancing authorities that we've been talking about and so forth. So if you notice in regions where there's an ISO, let's take the Mid-Continent ISO or MISO, for example, each of these bubbles is a balancing authority, an entity, typically a utility that's responsible for coordinating that portion of the power system. And so in regions where there's an RTO or an ISO, you can just observe there's one balancing authority for the most part. So PJM or MISO, or even California relative to the rest of the West. So one of the consequences of these large regional markets is to consolidate the balancing authorities, which then has the advantages that Amanda just articulated.
Great, thank you. So let's talk a moment to compare how generation planning is conducted, both in and out of RTOs.
So let's start with outside of RTO. So in those regions of the country, the utility is still vertically integrated. It still owns generation, transmission, and distribution. Now, its generation assets may be competing in part with Frank Felder, the IPP, who's trying to sell to Amanda, a municipality or another buyer of electricity. And those utilities, because the generation portion and the distribution are regulated at the state level, so it's a state public utility commission or public service commission that determines the rates that the retail, the end use customer pays. That utility typically develops with stakeholder input and review an integrated resource plan. So a generation plan, but also it's linked to transmission and energy efficiency programs and so forth. And that plan looks out typically 10 years or so. It assesses the forecast for demand. It figures out which power plant should be retired, what new ones should be built or repowered or expanded, and along with that, additional investments in transmission. So it's under a planning model that eventually is approved by the state regulator, and then the utility goes off and builds those assets, or maybe they contract with me, independent power producers, to fill in some of their gaps. In our RTO or ISO market, it depends. There are some states where the utilities within that state have sold off their generation. So the utility is just a transmission and distribution entity. So it wouldn't make sense for an entity that only owns transmission and distribution to develop an integrated resource plan across generation, transmission, and demand side management. So the determination of what power plants are built or retired, their strategies or operations are determined by the market, by price signals that we've been discussing. Now, the ISO RTO, for reliability reasons, called resource adequacy, to make sure there's sufficient supply to meet demand, will set, as you mentioned, the reserve levels, this extra 15%, just to pick a number, that the region must meet. But then it's up to the market to figure out, when I mean the market, the individual investors and generation units and operators, what to do with their individual assets in response to those market requirements and that, let's say, 15% reserve margin. So it's much more decentralized. Now, there are some states in RTO markets that are still vertically integrated. So they are both typically submitting an integrated resource plan. But of course, as you pointed out at the beginning, they're responding to the market conditions in their RTO. And presumably regulators and state policymakers are asking, can we buy from the market? Is that cheaper? What are the resource adequacy implications and so forth?
Yeah, and when I ran an energy office, I knew very well how my utilities were regulated and how the system was set up, but I was less familiar with all these different maturations, right? Does my utility own generation? Do they sell generation? Am I a restructured state or am I a non-restructured state? So there's a lot of terms there to make sure you're aware of, because when trying to deal with other states around you, it's important to know how they are structured and regulated. So thanks for that. So generation planning and investment are linked with the electricity sector. What concerns are are we seeing related to reliability and the effect on generation planning and investment?
So one is load growth. So up until, let's say, for the last 10 or 15 years or so, demand growth, when I mean load, increase in electricity demand. The demand for electricity was relatively flat. Maybe it grew at roughly 0.5% a year, so very slightly. Over the last 2 years or so, particularly in the last year, the forecast for electricity demand growth, obviously it varies by region of the country, is now 2 or 3%. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but in a massive power system where you have huge capital investments in generation and transmission, and you're trying to align those investments, one under a market model, for the most part, one under a planning model with some nuances, that's tough. And so that load growth driven by electrification, a large part are data centers, AI, computational, but not only, is a challenge. So that goes directly to the reliability problem or issue of resource adequacy. Do we just have enough supply to meet demand? And of course, electricity, that's very important. You don't want to run out. The second is just it's a large infrastructure, the power system, generation and transmission. It's been built over a long period of time. Existing power plants get old, and at some point, just like your car, you got to buy a new one. The maintenance bills are more than buying the cost of buying and the value in a new car. And so there are retirements of coal plants, but other power plants just due to aging. There's new technologies that they're not new anymore, but rapidly deployed technology, solar, wind, energy storage, but also nuclear, geothermal. They're at different levels of maturity and deployment, but that too affects the power system, how to integrate these different technologies, some already in the system, some more newer, while you're accommodating the rapid increase in demand. And then just handling a severe weather, particularly as the system becomes, as we become society more dependent on electricity, then it becomes even more important to have a power system, generation, transmission, distribution, that is reliable, that can respond to severe weather events, cold weather, storms, but also other things that threaten the reliability and resiliency of the system.
Great. That's a great list, and it's a lot to watch. So in the Southwest, or I'm sorry, in the West and the Southeast, there are market initiatives in progress. So there's a lot of interest in developing regional market. I know in the West, we've been working on this for more than a decade. What are they, and how do they compare to full RTO and ISO's markets?
So next slide, please. So let's start with the Southeast. Here's a map of an initiative. So as I mentioned, as we discussed, the Southeast is a physical bilateral or a decentralized market, individual buyers and sellers. The large players are utilities, typically investor-owned utilities, but also TVA is a major player, and municipalities and so forth. So the South has developed what's called SEAM, the Southeast Electricity Market. It is a short-term bilateral market that matches buyers and sellers. So if you're conducting business in the electricity market, either as a buyer or a seller, you're thinking about how much electricity do I buy and sell 5 minutes from now, an hour from now, 2 years from now? And having the ability to balance or match at a very short period of time is very important for some of the reasons you talked about, improving efficiency and operations, particularly as we introduce or continue to introduce different types of generation resources, for example, solar and wind. And so the SEAM market is a short-term balancing market that matches buyers and sellers, given what they're willing to buy and sell at throughout the Southeast.
Great. Next slide.
Yeah, so now moving on to the West. So the West, there's, as you mentioned, the effort's been long-standing. So you'll see on the kind of the orange and yellow graph or map, you'll see the California ISO, Cal ISO. So that's an RTO, that's a centralized market. The rest of the West, the West outside of California, has a short-term balancing market. There are two major players in that. One is the California ISO, so that's the map, the orange-yellow map, and that's the Western Electricity Imbalance Market. So here we're using the term balance or imbalance as a short-term, it signifies the short-term matching of supply and demand. With electricity, it's just fundamental that you have to match supply and demand. It's kind of the ultimate real-time system. And that system is operated, managed by the California ISO, even though it extends to about 80% of the Western market. A similar market, short-term balancing market, is also being organized and is working by SPP. So that's the Southwest Power Pool. And its designation is the Western Electricity and Balance Service Markets. So we have two different organizers, administrators of a short-term market that are reaching into the western part of the grid outside of California.
And both these products we're looking at expansion. So these are what they call real-time markets because they can provide electricity to purchase minute to minute, as you mentioned. But there's also day ahead. So day ahead is where they take the next step towards a full RTO and they start planning on what generation needs do we have to meet all the system needs in the day ahead. So those are both emerging and being developed right now, right?
That's right. So, and those markets are still under development, but are anticipated to be implemented within the next year or so. So in the case of California, again, a little bit of acronyms, it's the extended day ahead. So that's differentiating it from the real-time market, EDAM. And SPP is called Markets Plus, SPP Markets Plus. Again, reflecting this notion, not only do you want to think about the next 5 minutes, but over the next 24 hours to plan and then have markets match buyers and sellers over that longer period of time.
And Frank, you had talked about that RTOs or ISOs provide all 4 key services. That's when you have a full RTO or ISO. What we're seeing in the West and maybe the Southeast is that we're developing these market products as they're needed. And so the term is it's incremental development. Will we get to a full RTO or ISO in the West? Maybe, but we don't know. We're just on that pathway. I did want to mention actually the Pathways Initiative,
Right.
which is there's an initiative to have the California Independent System Operator change its governance structure so that it could actually provide energy services west-wide, and it would be governed by a board of representatives from throughout the West, because some entities are interested in the services that California Independent System Operator can provide, but since that is governed by the California, appointed by the California legislature, folks are not interested in joining that. So the Pathway Initiative is another development in the West that's important to pay attention to. So let's talk about governance and markets. We talked that there's all these different products and they are governed in different ways. So how are electricity markets governed under an RTO or ISO?
So it seems maybe a little strange to some to think about why are we talking about governance for markets? And the whole point of a market is we don't have governance, right? We don't have a governance system for the market of pencils. But because of the complexities of electricity, both just the operation over a large region, the fast-moving nature of power of electricity, so to speak, and also the interconnection or the linkage to transmission planning, there's a governance structure where stakeholders participate in developing the rules. So the RTO itself has a board, and as you mentioned in California, for the California ISO, not surprisingly, California appoints the board members. But if you expand that governance structure to other states, it raises the political issue, the governance issue that you just mentioned. So the RTO is an organization. Technically, it's a utility, but 400 people or however many people operating and planning these complex markets in the transmission system. And it is then governed at the senior level by a board of directors. In addition, kind of parallel but integrated with that is a stakeholder process, and different RTOs have different versions, but kind of at a high level enough, stakeholders have input into the various market rules and their changes, and there's a process in which the RTO and the stakeholders, through a committee process, develop these rules all the way to the definition of what a market clearing price, credit policy, how to do transmission planning, and eventually that results in a tariff, a legal document that is approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission outside of Texas. And so given the highly regulated nature, even of these RTO markets and transmission system, there's this governance process that refers to not only how the RTO itself makes decisions, its board of directors, but how it does that in conjunction with stakeholders. When do stakeholders get input? How much input do they get? Do they get to vote on rules? And then eventually that's reviewed and approved or changed, modified by the FERC, again, with Texas as an exception.
Great. And so for state energy offices, that participation by states in these different committees that are formed in markets is a really key place for states to both watch what's happening and then be able to give input when it's appropriate. Okay.
Exactly.
Great. Okay. So what are some of the challenges we see in market governance?
So, and again, I'm going to list some challenges, and people recognize them and are working hard to try to find solutions or improve them. But one is just the resources of states. So if you're one state in a region that has 14 other states participating in an RTO or however many, just having the resources to attend and monitor and review these various committees for market design, reliability, financial policies, et cetera, is just resource intensive. It takes a lot of time. These rules are technical and also both technically engineering, but also economic. They have important public policy implications. And so it's just a time-consuming process because it's a stakeholder-driven process. And these RTOs have large numbers of stakeholders, members. A second is just the transparency. So if you picked up the tariff that I mentioned that codifies the rules at the PJM or the Mid-Continent ISO, first of all, it's just not one document, but it's a long document. And it just takes a level of exposure and experience and technical background in order to understand what they're doing. And it's not just the tariff, but technical manuals on capacity requirements, transmission planning. So that's just the issue in terms of just ability to absorb the material given the resources. And finally, is just a voice. Again, as these markets become larger over more states, there's just, a state is competing with other states to shape policy the way they would like it.
And all of this is complicated, and the sooner we dig in and start to understand it, the better off that you'll be. So you mentioned that markets are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So FERC is a 5-member agency located in Washington, D.C., appointed by the president, approved by the Senate. And its role in life is it regulates the interstate transaction of electricity, among other things. So it regulates both these RTOs, exactly down to all these details I alluded to, but it also regulates the other parts of the country that don't yet have an RTO. So if I'm an integrated utility in the Southeast, for example, and the price I can charge to use my transmission system, I have a tariff with FERC that stipulates that I have to allow independent power producers to use my transmission system, assuming it's available at a certain rate under certain technical conditions. and so forth. So the FERC is responsible for the interstate flow of electricity, and as a result, that means it's the regulator, again, outside of Texas, for all parts of the continental US, both RTOs and non-RTO regions.
Yeah, thank you. So we're getting close to time, and I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat. Let's shift a little bit to transmission planning. So we've been talking about electricity markets, but there's a whole piece underneath that. Transmission is important for system reliability and for getting generation on the system. So can you talk about how transmission is planned and resources are interconnected in a wholesale market?
So in a non-RTO market, the utility, as part of its integrated resource plan, would figure out what transmission needs to be built to accommodate load growth in our example and retirements and new generation. And it would also coordinate with its neighboring utilities and maybe its neighbors of neighbors, maybe for reliability or economic purposes, having a joint transmission investment among 3 or 4 utilities makes a lot of sense given the conditions. But it's primarily driven by the electric utility as part of its integrated resource planning, integrating its generation planning with its expansion of its transmission system. Within a RTO, it's driven, the vanguard, the leader is the RTO trying to conduct a regional transmission plan that accommodates both restructured states, as I mentioned, those that have sold off their generation, but still transmission planning is very important to get access to the market, but also in those states, part of an RTO that are structured where they still have an integrated utility. But it's really the RTO that's now planning region-wide and along with its neighbors. The neighbors could be another RTO, or it could be a group of utilities, such as in California currently. So it's, but the utilities are still, and other stakeholders heavily involved in the stakeholder processes and the planning processes within an RTO.
Good, great, thank you. So I want to get you to summarize from us, what are some of the key takeaways that we've covered in this webinar? Because we've covered a lot of ground. So, and then we've got some great questions in the chat I want to get to.
So I'll try to be brief. So one is, as you pointed out, the evolving nature of markets and at the current status, the incremental development of markets and some of their expansions that we discussed in both the Southeast and in the West. And their implications for states. So understanding that evolution continues, and it will probably continue for a long period of time, is very important. The second is for states to continue to contribute to those developments, not just understanding what's going on, but figure out how they can leverage their resources either individually through attending various forums and participating, going down to FERC and making their case, so to speak, to state organizations that support states within an RTO to collectively raise the voice, so to speak, to be involved in the formation of the markets in those working groups, whatever the types that we've been discussing, and also participating in state regulatory proceedings that affect markets and transmission planning.
And I would add, come to NASEO, because NASEO is also tracking market development and they're here to assist you. So let me go to some questions. Thanks so much for doing that big download. The first one is, can you talk a bit more about system? No, I don't want to do that one. Hold on, let me go do this one. Can you talk a little bit about how electricity structures impact retail electricity rates and what options states have to try to impact what rates their customers are being charged?
Yeah, so maybe the next slide will help on this.
Okay.
So it depends. It depends on which type of market structure you're in. So remember at the outset, we said there were 2 major ones. So in this little, I guess, organizational chart of markets, either you're in an organized market or a physical bilateral market. Now, to be honest, some states may be part of both. Some of their utilities are in one or the other, but put that aside. Within a physical bilateral market, so that's the right-hand side, or at least my right-hand side of this chart, the way rates are set and the primary impact is generation and distribution. So that's probably roughly 80% of a customer's bill, an end-use customer or retail customer's bill. And that's determined at the state level by the Public Utility Commission via the Integrated Resource Plan that determines the generation cost, which is reflected in the generation rate or price for the electrons, and the distribution planning. Are there enough local delivery assets from the transmission system to all the homes and businesses and so forth? As I mentioned, the transmission piece of the bill, which is roughly 10 to 20%, perhaps growing in some regions, is set by the FERC outside of Texas, by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But states do have some avenues to petition the FERC to review that and to work with their utilities on the transmission side of that. So for physical bilateral markets, primarily it's through state Public Utility Commission rate making and planning processes. On the left-hand side, we have these organized markets or RTO ISO markets, and then we have to do one more subdivision. Again, I'm speaking somewhat generically. For those states where the utility continues to own and operate generation, so sometimes referred to as non-restructured states or integrated states, state rates for generation are determined, just as I mentioned, just like in physical bilateral, via the integrated resource planning process and rate making process. Although, of course, by being within an RTO, the viability, the economics of a utilities generation is now more closely competing with the other generation units in that market. If you go to the right-hand side, the bottom division where the utilities are only transmission and distribution, the generation portion of the bill is set by market conditions. So if the supply is tight and demand is increasing, the wholesale price for electric energy is increasing, and then that flows through to the retail part that also includes the transmission set by the FERC based on the RTO's planning, and the distribution piece set by the state's Public Service Commission.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more about system visibility, why it's important and how it varies from one market structure to another?
Yeah, so I think the map to have in mind is that balancing authority map. So there's several things. One is the RTOs publish these prices, both the short-term prices and the long-term price, the day-ahead prices that anyone, you and I, can go and see, even though I suspect you and I aren't trading power day to day or hour by hour. So that's the price visibility. That's very important. And then the efforts we talked about in the West and in the Southeast are also extending that price visibility across a larger region and more players. The second is just operational integration. So if you consolidate balancing authorities, one way is through a regional market, but there are other ways to do that as well. Then you have the system operator, the entity. Remember, the ISO is a system operator in addition to operating markets, is managing and operating a larger system in a more integrated way, real time and day ahead and planning. And so that improves both operational visibility, but also, as I just mentioned, pricing visibility for buyers and sellers in the wholesale market.
And one of the things I've seen develop in markets is that as there's more interconnectivity and one entity that's watching the system, it helps reliability because they can start to spot issues maybe with a generator, and then that can help you avoid system issues. So there's one kind of master eyes on the system to be able to see what's happening, and then can move power around or turn on extra generators, where when you have an individual utility, they only have their own resources to be able to call on, and they can't see what their neighbors are doing. So thanks for that. Let's squeeze in one more if we can. What are the main opportunities, and you touched on some of this, but what are the main opportunities for State Energy Office to engage with RTOs and ISOs versus remaining in bilateral market structures like SEAMs?
So I guess I think there are different ways. So one is in the West looks different than the Southeast in this regard. just in terms of where the markets and other parts of the region are. So one is to figure out what the state wants to do, right? What are its objectives, what its priorities are, and which type of market mechanisms and development and evolution, if I can use that term, it thinks makes the most sense given its generation resource base, its economic base, its priorities and policies, and so forth. So as I mentioned, the first step is to figuring out what's going on in the region, what market mechanisms are available, how do they contrast with integrated resource planning. So it's really a comparative exercise, kind of trading off and figuring out how to enhance the relative benefits between different options. If a state is thinking about, if it's in an RTO or thinking about joining an RTO or supporting an RTO, I would say get in early in terms of understanding what that RTO is. And I assure you, you will realize it's a daunting but doable task. So just understanding the different committees, the governance structure, who the players are, what the market structure is, and which rules really matter and policies matter is important. And there are, again, various forms, both the RTO stakeholder process, but regulatory forms where regulators group together to influence electricity markets, whether in RTO or not.
Yeah, and I would also say that whether your state's engaged in markets or not, there have been a number of states that have, and they've assigned staff to deal with this, and so there's peer learning that can happen, which I think is pretty beneficial. So Frank, I want to say thank you for your time. This was kind of a fun discussion, and I'm going to throw it back to Marion.
Great. Thank you, Amanda.
Oh, you're on mute. Yeah. You're still on mute.
I didn't want my dog to be interrupting the webinar, but I want to add my thanks to both of you for a tremendous webinar. And I will say, you're in the West, Amanda. Frank, you're on the East Coast. I am up in New England, in Rhode Island, and we work very closely with our other states, and we are very fortunate to have technical resources available through NESEO, the Northeast States Committee on Electricity, which has a voice in our RTO. And one of the things I was thinking as we went through the webinar is that we had initially targeted this program for states that were not yet in a formal organized market, but I think, as everyone is aware, because of the reliability challenges, because of concerns about affordability and economic development, this whole issue of market structure is of concern across the country, whether you're in an organized market like I am in New England or in an area where there's not yet an organized market. So thanks so much for the information. We'll post a recording of the webinar on the NASEO website. We have a whole suite of other educational materials on the website with more to come. We'll be hosting discussions with southern and western states later in the week. And importantly, we are hosting an in-person workshop on these issues. Regional electricity collaboration across the United States, powering the grid for economic development is the formal title. Be held in Salt Lake City in the latter part of August 26th and 27th. And if you have any questions on that, you can check it out on the NASEO website or reach out to us for more information. I think it's going to be a terrific session. We have a lot of great speakers and a lot of interest. So once again, thanks so much to everyone. Thanks to GDO and the Department of Energy for their support, and to NASEO for organizing the event. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, depending on what part of the country you're in.